Whispers from the War: The Unseen Romances That Defined a Generation. Part 1. The Foundations of War and Love. The story is set against the backdrop of the Ember Conflict, a fictionalized global war echoing the intensity of World War II, spanning the years 1941 to 1945. This historical analog provides the necessary stage for widespread conflict and severe social restrictions, making any unseen romance an inherently dangerous, rebellious act. The narrative is primarily split between the atmospheric, constantly threatened port city of Oakhaven on the British home front, and the desolate, freezing conditions of the Eastern Front. This era is defined by extreme social rigidity, showing public affection is frowned upon, and certain types of love, particularly same-sex relationships, are brutally criminalized, underscoring why the unseen nature of these romances is fundamentally a matter of survival, not merely discretion. The first main protagonist is Elias Eli Thorne, 24, an introverted, brilliant cartographer drafted into the Royal Logistics Corps, stationed in Oakhaven. His official duty is the meticulous charting of troop movements and supply lines, a role that gives him both isolation and access to sensitive information. His unseen life is centered on his deep, forbidden relationship with a fellow soldier, Thomas, a bond they must conceal with absolute perfection. Eli is defined by his need for control and routine, habits born from his work and necessary for masking his truth. His internal conflict is the agonizing tension between his duty to the war effort and the desperate, life-affirming need to be authentically himself with the one person who truly sees him. This secret love is his only anchor against the psychological pressure, yet it is also the greatest danger he faces. The second core protagonist is Clara Vance, 22, a volunteer nurse at St. Jude's Military Hospital in Oakhaven. She is pragmatic, resilient, and possesses a quiet, determined strength born from years of enduring community hardship. Her romance is not with a soldier, but with a recently arrived, highly educated, and fiercely independent female surgeon, Dr. Eleanor Albright, a relationship that blossoms in the small, late-night hours they share away from the chaotic wards. Clara's story explores how care and passion become dangerously intertwined in high-stress environments. Her conflict lies in the constant moral tightrope walk of protecting her secret while caring for the men fighting a war often framed as defending traditional morality, forcing her to move through the hospital as a shadow, her true heart guarded by a facade of professional stoicism. The central conflict driving the entire 100,000-word narrative is the clash between totalitarian morality and personal passion. The war forces society to focus on a singular external enemy, but for Eli and Clara, the greater, more immediate threat is the internal enemy, the prevailing prejudice and criminal laws of their own society. The novel will explore three critical layers of secrecy: the secrets of war, intelligence, covert operations; the secrets of self, identity and hidden desires; and the secrets of love, clandestine meetings, coded letters, and shared glances. Their romances are thus framed not merely as side stories, but as acts of profound personal rebellion and sanity, proving that humanity and affection can endure and define a generation, even when the world demands conformity and destruction. Fountain Pen, Part 2. To sustain the novel over 100,000 words, the plot is broken into three escalating books. Book I, The Seeds of Silence, approximate 35,000 words, establishes the complex rules of secrecy, with Eli using coded marks and maps for his partner Thomas, and Clara and Dr. Albright communicating through carefully timed signals in hospital charts. This section details the psychological pressure of their clandestine rituals and culminates in a near miss where both couples are almost discovered, confirming the life-or-death stakes. Book 2, The Crisis of Exposure, approximate 35,000 words, introduces a major, sustained external threat, the arrival of a highly conservative, watchful officer in Eli's unit and the unjust professional targeting of Dr. Albright at St. Jude's. This leads to the painful separation and distance when Thomas is deployed to the Eastern Front, forcing Eli to rely solely on dangerous, coded letters. The section peaks with Clara facing an ultimate sacrifice, risking her career to save Dr. Albright, and Eli receiving a cryptic final message that forces him toward the perilous crossroads of deserting his post to help Thomas. Book 3, Defiance and Defining the Generation, approximate 30,000 words, brings the action to a climax. Eli undertakes an unauthorized journey toward the front line, a perilous convergence. Clara makes a controlled confession to protect her love, shifting their relationship into a fragile public existence. The novel climaxes with the unseen meeting as Eli finds Thomas severely wounded and must organize a minute-by-minute, high-tension escape. The story resolves with a defining end after the war concludes, exploring how these hard-won, silent romances survive the transition from wartime necessity to peacetime scrutiny, forever shaping the silent narratives of their generation. Fountain Penned, Part 3, The Opening Chapter. Chapter 1, The Weight of Ink and Silence. The blackout was absolute, a suffocating velvet cowl pulled over the industrial port of Oak Haven. Tonight, the silence was thicker than usual, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic clang of the dock cranes and the anxious rattle of the coal stove in the back of the Royal Logistics Corps mapping hut. Corporal Elias Thorne, known to his small cadre as Eli, did not look up from the maps spread across his pine drafting table. The paper beneath his fingers was a new edition of the Eastern Front supply lines, a spiderweb of brittle red and blue ink. Yet the lines that truly consumed his attention were the tiny, almost invisible prick marks he made with a pin, a cartographer's secret code. He was marking a position that had no strategic value to the War Office, but held the entire weight of his private world, the location of a forward artillery detachment, and the heart of his partner, Thomas. Eli finished his mark, a minute, coded star hidden within the coordinates of a frozen river junction, and then began the ritualistic inspection of the accompanying manifest. It was a list of medical supplies destined for Thomas's unit, and tucked meticulously beneath the flap of a tin of surgical sutures, Eli found his reply. It was a thin strip of paper, no larger than a thumb, containing 3 lines written in the distinctive, hurried hand he had memorized like a hymn. The ice holds. The silence is loud. We'll see the old bridge. The old bridge was their signal for a specific, derelict warehouse near the docks, their designated meeting point for a few stolen hours. This clandestine exchange was their lifeline, a testament to enduring passion forged not in the sun, but in the deepest shadow of devastation. Eli immediately burned the slip of paper in the stove, watching the precious ink curl and vanish into ash, then carefully placed the surgical tin back into the larger supply crate, the physical evidence of their connection gone, leaving only the fierce, dangerous joy pulsing in his chest. Meanwhile, across the city, the air in St. Jude's Military Hospital was thick with a metallic scent of antiseptic and stale sweat. Clara Vance moved through the triage ward with the practiced, weightless efficiency of a veteran. She checked the drip for a young private with shrapnel in his thigh, her movements mechanical, her eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a soul too long exposed to suffering. Her thoughts, however, were on the precise, measured rhythm of Dr. Eleanor Albright's movements at the end of the hall. Dr. Albright was finishing a grueling 6-hour surgery, a woman who represented a different kind of defiance, leading a major surgical team with an unflinching competence that had earned her begrudging respect and jealous suspicion. As Clara straightened the private's blanket, she felt the doctor's eyes meet hers across the bloodied ward. It was a glance of perfect, silent understanding, a recognition that transcended the chaos of the operating room. When Dr. Albright finally stripped off her surgical gloves, she paused by the nurse's station, ostensibly to discuss post-operative care, but as she handed Clara the chart, her index finger tapped a specific point on the page. The time 2300 hours. This was their quiet code for the rarely used, secluded boiler room beneath the old wing, a sanctuary of steam pipes and shadows where their own, profound human connection was permitted to breathe. Clara accepted the chart, her heart giving a slow, grateful thump against her ribs. The simple numerical cipher, a promise of endurance, a counter-narrative to the destruction that defined their days. Chapter 2. The Old Bridge and the Weight of Presence. The perilous journey. The air in Oakhaven was not cold, it was biting, a damp, metallic chill that burrowed deep into the bones and promised pneumonia. Eli abandoned the rigid order of the barracks at 10 minutes past the hour, leaving a dummy figure beneath his blanket, and ensuring his boots were packed with enough mud to suggest an innocent, hurried trip to the latrine. Every step away from the garrison felt like tearing a ligament. The fear of discovery was a constant, sharp muscle spasm in his lower back. He moved with the precise, mechanical grace of a man who spent his life measuring distance, hugging the darkest shadows beneath the low, stone walls of the supply depots. The moon, what little sliver of it penetrated the perpetual smog of the industrial city, was masked completely by the strict blackout regulations, turning the streets into a treacherous maze of unseen curbs and abandoned machinery. His route to the derelict warehouse, the old bridge, was a carefully rehearsed map in his mind. 3 left turns, a hop over the bombed-out shell of a bakery, and a silent traverse across the rusting railway siding where surveillance was minimal but the potential for an accidental fall into the tracks was high. The greatest threat was not enemy bombers, but the local civil defense warden, a retired, zealous dock foreman known as Mr. Finch, who patrolled with the grim certainty of a man who believed every shadow concealed a saboteur. Eli pressed himself against the cold brick of an oil tank, listening to the echoing tap of Finch's cane disappear down a neighboring alley before he continued his run, the rough wool of his uniform scratching against his chin. He was no longer Corporal Thorne, the meticulous cartographer. He was a desperate civilian, fueled only by the 3 words Thomas had sent: "We'll see the old bridge." The sanctuary of dust and rust. The warehouse was a skeletal ruin, bombed out a year prior and abandoned due to structural instability. Its only remaining feature of note was a corroded iron gantry crane, the old bridge, that spanned the vast, debris-strewn interior. Eli found the hidden entry, a loose sheet of corrugated iron pried back just enough to admit a slim body, and slipped inside. The air was still, tasting of concrete dust, brine, and the ghost of old cargo. He stood motionless for a full 60 seconds, listening not for a siren, but for the specific, shallow sound of heavy, rapid breathing, the signal Thomas always gave upon arrival. Silence. The crushing doubt that always accompanied these meetings began to bloom in his chest. What if he couldn't make it? What if the message was intercepted? He moved deeper, navigating by memory toward the massive stone pier of the gantry, their customary meeting point. Just as the anxiety reached its peak, a sound materialized from the absolute darkness. 2 faint, deliberate taps against a nearby concrete column. Eli's entire body unlocked. He pressed his knuckles to his mouth, a silent, immediate surge of relief flooding his senses, so potent it felt like a dizzying head rush. He did not speak. In this space, silence was the highest form of trust. He walked the final 5 steps, rounding the pier, and found Thomas waiting. The weight of presence. Thomas was leaning against the cold stone, his silhouette barely visible against a faint splash of moonlight that filtered through a high-shell hole in the roof. He wore his heavy army greatcoat, which made him look impossibly broad and intimidating, a shield against both the elements and the world. He hadn't shaved, the dark stubble emphasizing the exhaustion beneath his eyes, and his presence carried the faint, pervasive scent of gunpowder and freezing earth, the unmistakable odor of the front line. Eli did not hesitate. He closed the distance in one breath, burying his face into the rough wool of Thomas's shoulder, inhaling the scent of him, which was fear, home, and survival, all at once. They did not speak for a long time. The sustained silence was the language of their love, a necessary refuge from the endless noise and interrogation of their lives. Thomas wrapped his arms tightly around Eli, the weight of the greatcoat and the muscle beneath it a sudden, comforting burden. This hug was everything they couldn't be in the light, a confession, a promise, and a mutual acknowledgement of the terrifying fragility of their bond. Eli could feel the steady, powerful thumping of Thomas's heart against his ear, a biological, undeniable fact that countered the thousands of lies they had to tell every day. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that barely disturbed the dust motes. 3 days. Only 3 days, Eli. I used the transfer to restock the coastal defenses. A few hours before I have to head back to the train. His words were clipped, efficient, framed in military language even here, in their sanctuary. Eli pulled back just enough to look at him, reaching up to touch the faint, grime-filled scar above Thomas's eyebrow, a souvenir from a close call he had only heard about in a censored letter. It was too risky, Eli murmured, the fear finally giving way to a soft, fierce anger born of love. The manifest, Thomas. You know the consequences. Thomas caught Eli's hand and pressed it hard against his own chest. The risk is always there, my love. But not seeing you. That's the one risk I can't afford to take. We lose ourselves then. The war wins everything. Their eyes met, two pairs of shadows seeing each other in the dark, and in that protracted moment, the entire brutal mechanism of the Ember conflict faded away, replaced by the profound, unspoken truth of two lives defying oblivion together. This fleeting, dangerous presence was their entire war, and their only victory. Chapter 3. The Heat of the Boiler Room. The Descent into Steam. Clara's watch, strapped over her starched cuff, read 22:55. The silence in the wards was heavy, a fragile truce between the living and the recently departed, punctuated only by the shallow, rattling breaths of the critically wounded. She had executed her own escape ritual with the professional ease of years, charting an extra hour's worth of patient observations, ensuring the night nurse was settled, and leaving a carefully placed, nondescript note on the matron's desk stating she was checking the eastern wing boiler pressure due to a persistent draft. Every lie she told was a defense of their shared truth. The descent to the old boiler room beneath the western wing was like entering a separate, humid world. The air grew immediately warmer, thicker with the metallic tang of heated water and the low, vibrant hum of the massive coal-fed mechanisms. The hospital's main lifeblood ran through this low-ceilinged space. Clara navigated the narrow, cluttered pathways between the great cylindrical boilers, their surfaces hot enough to scald, illuminated only by the few bare, caged bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows. Unlike Eli's rendezvous in a freezing, bombed-out ruin, Clara and Eleanor met in a place of life-giving, industrial heat, a sanctuary built on the necessary functions of the very institution that constrained them. The quiet authority. She found Dr. Albright waiting near the main pressure gauge, a space protected by a towering, silent condenser pipe. Eleanor was still wearing her surgical scrubs, though she had shed the protective gown and cap, her dark, sensible hair pulled back tight. She held a steaming mug of tea, the ceramic warmth a small luxury in this grim time. The tension that always clung to her shoulders in the operating theater seemed to dissolve the moment she saw Clara. Eleanor was usually a figure of commanding, uncompromising authority. But here, she was simply Eleanor, weary and profoundly exposed. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register that was almost lost beneath the constant thrumming of the machinery. She did not move towards her immediately. In this hospital, professional distance was instinctual, a habit stronger than desire. But her eyes spoke volumes, dark and relieved, tracing the tired lines etched around Clara's mouth. "The private in bed 7, the one with the shrapnel, he will live. You were excellent tonight. Your observations were precise, they saved us critical time." Clara took the compliment not with pride, but with a deep, private gratitude for the recognition of her full self, the professional who saves lives, and the woman who seeks connection. "It was your skill, Doctor. You worked without pause." She accepted the tea offered to her, the heat immediately settling the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "I saw the matron lingering near the station earlier. She watches you. She watches all of us." The name of the stern, observant matron, Mrs. Davies, needed no further elaboration. She was the silent, ever-present embodiment of the society that judged them. Intimacy forged in trauma. Eleanor leaned her head back against the cool metal of the pipe, closing her eyes for a fleeting second of exhaustion. Davies sees only what she expects to see. The career woman, the lack of a husband. She doesn't see the hundreds of wounds we seal in a week, only the potential moral failings of the staff. She opened her eyes, and the authority returned, but this time, it was directed solely at Clara, an intimate, powerful focus. "The truth is, Clara, this hospital is a fortress, but it is also a prison. I can command men in an operating theater, but I cannot walk hand in hand with you down a street lit by the moon." This conversation was their necessary ritual, unloading the emotional weight of their lives onto each other. They discussed the latest influx of casualties, the rationing, the absurdity of a life where they saved bodies only to have their spirits starved by secrecy. It was a space where the trauma they witnessed became the foundation of their bond. In a world tearing itself apart, the fact that they could speak honestly about their fear, their exhaustion, and their mutual yearning was the greatest intimacy they possessed. Clara moved closer, not touching her yet, but standing in the orbit of her heat, their shoulders almost brushing. "Did you bring it?" she asked quietly. Eleanor smiled faintly, a small, weary twist of the lips. From the deep pocket of her scrubs, she produced a folded piece of paper, not a coded note or a chart, but a clipping from a science journal about new surgical techniques. Hidden within the dense technical jargon, she had circled a single paragraph describing the properties of a rare anesthetic. Scattered around the text, she had inserted tiny, hand-drawn asterisks. Each asterisk represented a letter, forming the words, "I dreamt of peacetime." Clara took the clipping, her fingers momentarily brushing Eleanor's. It was a promise of a future they might never see, a shared vision tucked away inside the language of their life-saving professions. In the deafening, comforting roar of the boilers, Clara finally allowed herself to take Eleanor's hand, the touch of fierce, quiet declaration of love that defied every rule of the war and the hospital walls. Chapter 4: The Shadow of the Lieutenant. A routine shattered. 2 weeks after his clandestine meeting with Thomas at the old bridge warehouse, a rigid, suffocating normalcy had settled back into Eli's life. The fear, however, never truly receded. It was a constant, dull throb beneath his ribs, a low-frequency hum that accompanied every mundane task. His days were consumed by the meticulous mapping of convoys and the equally meticulous choreography of intercepting Thomas's infrequent, coded messages in the inbound mail. Each successful exchange was a small, quiet victory against the vast indifference of the war. But peace, even the ersatz peace of routine, was always fleeting in Oakhaven. The disruption arrived not in the form of enemy bombs, but in the polished, unforgiving boots of Lieutenant Alistair Finch. Not to be confused with a local civil defense warden, this Finch was a distant, younger relative, newly transferred from a highly decorated intelligence unit. Lieutenant Finch was a man built for the new era of total war. Sharp-eyed, fiercely ambitious, and possessing an unnerving ability to detect deviation from the rigid military order. He strode into the logistics corps office like a cold draft, his presence immediately tightening every jaw in the room. His stated purpose was to improve efficiency and security protocols, but Eli felt the unspoken objective hanging in the air like gunpowder, to root out anything deemed unorthodox or morally suspect. The intercepted dispatch. One particularly dreary Tuesday, a large consignment of specialized anti-aircraft parts arrived at the Oakhaven docks, accompanied by an unusually bulky manifest. This manifest was Eli's primary channel for receiving communications from Thomas, who was still entrenched on the Eastern Front. Thomas, aware of the increased scrutiny on all mail, had warned Eli in a previous coded message that his next dispatch would be hidden deeper, perhaps within the paperwork for a critical, time-sensitive delivery. Eli's heart had sunk. Critical deliveries were often expedited, sometimes bypassing his meticulous sorting table entirely. Eli was hunched over a complex naval chart, detailing new minefield placements, when Lieutenant Finch's crisp voice cut through the quiet hum of the office. "Thorn. That last manifest, the one for the AA battery components. I noticed an anomaly in the serial numbers. Bring it to my office immediately." Eli's blood ran cold. The manifest. The large, bulky manifest. He had just finished a cursory check of it, quickly scanning the standard pages, but he hadn't yet been able to fully dissect it for Thomas's hidden message. He had allowed himself a moment of complacency, believing the sheer volume of paperwork would shield their communication. Now, Finch had plucked it from the stack, an eagle spotting a field mouse. Eli swallowed, forcing his expression into one of professional neutrality. "Yes, Lieutenant. Right away." His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved the thick dossier. He knew Thomas often used a false serial number or an extra, duplicate page, embedding his 3 or 4 coded words within the minute details of the inventory. If Finch scrutinized it with his intelligence background, the seemingly random discrepancy could easily lead to a full investigation. Not just of the manifest, but of Eli's meticulous, isolated work habits, and inevitably, of his correspondence with Thomas. The consequences would be catastrophic. The razor's edge. He walked the short distance to Finch's office as if wading through treacle, every muscle screaming at him to turn back, to somehow destroy the evidence. He handed over the manifest, his gaze carefully averted from Finch's unervingly direct stare. The lieutenant, a man who seemed to derive perverse satisfaction from his own thoroughness, spread the papers across his desk. He tapped a long, manicured finger on a specific line item. "This here, Corporal. Serial number 337B. It should be 337C. A simple clerical error, you might think. But in my previous unit, such errors often pointed to irregularities." Eli forced himself to breathe. "Indeed, Lieutenant. I was just about to report that discrepancy for correction myself. Our scribes can be overwhelmed." It was a weak excuse, but it was all he had. Finch leaned back, his eyes narrowing, studying Eli, not just the paper. Eli felt like an insect pinned under a microscope. He could feel the tiny, almost invisible prick mark he had made on a nonsequential page, marking Thomas's last confirmed location, a ghost of their truth. He could almost visualize the extra, unnumbered inventory page that contained Thomas's newest coded message, perhaps a desperate plea for another meeting, perhaps news of his deployment elsewhere. Finch tapped his pen against the desk, the sound echoing ominously in the small office. "Very well, Thorn. See to its correction. But from now on, I want every manifest cross-referenced by a second clerk. And you will personally initial every single page. No more anomalies." He pushed the thick file back across the desk. Eli almost collapsed with relief, but forced himself to maintain a stiff, military posture. He took the manifest, his fingers brushing against the rough paper where Thomas's words lay hidden, still undiscovered. The lieutenant's suspicion was a palpable, living entity now, breathing down Eli's neck. As he walked away, the manifest clutched tightly in his hand. He knew one thing with chilling certainty. Their small, secret window of communication had just slammed shut. The risk was no longer just a possibility. It was an active, hunting predator, and Lieutenant Finch was its keenest tracker. Chapter 5. The Matron's Vigil. The breaking point of order. St. Jude's Hospital, usually a bastion of grim, organized chaos, buckled under the weight of the new casualties. A major skirmish on the nearby coast had flooded the receiving wards with men in less than an hour. Shrapnel wounds, severe burns, and fractured limbs requiring immediate, extensive intervention. The scent of blood and ether hung heavy, overpowering even the strong antiseptic. In the midst of this controlled frenzy, Matron Davies moved like a battleship, slow, formidable, and seemingly impervious to the storm around her. She was a fixture of the old order, viewing the war not just as a conflict of nations, but as a test of moral fortitude, and she judged any deviation from the strictest propriety as a weakness that could rot the entire military machine. Dr. Albright was operating in Theater 2, performing a difficult amputation under firelight, a procedure requiring a concentration so profound it bordered on transfixed stillness. Her chief scrub nurse, usually a reliable pillar, collapsed from exhaustion midway through the procedure, and Clara, who was covering the adjoining ward, was rushed in to assist. She moved seamlessly into the role, her hands anticipating Eleanor's needs. Instruments, swabs, ligatures, with the quiet synchronicity born of their shared, intense time together. This professional harmony was one of their greatest dangers. It was too perfect, suggesting an understanding that ran far deeper than the demands of a surgical team. The moment of recklessness. The temperature in the theater was stifling, the air thick with steam rising from the cleaning buckets. Towards the end of the operation, Eleanor, pale beneath her surgical mask, finally stepped back, signaling the completion of the most critical part. Her hands, usually steady as stone, were shaking slightly with fatigue. She murmured a quick instruction for the final stitching and then, without thinking, swayed slightly on her feet, leaning against the cold tile of the wall. In that instant, professionalism fractured. Clara, whose eyes had been fixed on Eleanor's tired frame, moved instantly. Ignoring the junior surgeon at the table, she snatched a clean, damp towel from the supply trolley and pressed it to Eleanor's forehead, her hand lingering for a fraction of a second, a gesture of profound, private care meant to offer immediate, cooling relief. It was a movement that no nurse would perform for a doctor in such a formal setting unless they shared a depth of connection that surpassed the professional barrier. Eleanor's eyes, heavy with exhaustion, met Clara's, and in that fleeting, exposed moment, they exchanged a look that held all their hidden history. The shared tea, the coded journal entries, the quiet comfort of the boiler room. It was raw, unmistakable tenderness. The public rebuke. They both snapped back to reality when the operating theater doors swung open, admitting the cold judgment of Matron Davies. She had come to check the status of the theater and stood framed in the doorway, her presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. Her gaze was not on the patient, nor the instruments, but directly on Clara, whose hand was still loosely gripping the towel, and Eleanor, who was rubbing her temples. Davies didn't need to see a kiss or a holding of hands. The quality of the care, the excessive intimacy of the attention, was enough. The matron did not raise her voice, which made her subsequent address all the more chilling. She waited until the patient was wheeled out and the theater was being scrubbed down. She walked over to Clara, ignoring Eleanor entirely, and addressed her in a low, precise whisper. "Nurse Vance, your efficiency is often commendable. However, I noticed a distinct lack of professional objectivity just now. You are here to serve the hospital, not to serve specific members of the medical staff in a manner that suggests undue familiarity." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she held the matron's gaze. "I was attending to the surgeon, matron." She was showing signs of distress. The surgeon, Davies retorted, her voice hardening, is perfectly capable of maintaining her own equilibrium, as she is a woman of high standing. You, Nurse Vance, are a volunteer subordinate. Your duty is to the patient and the proper procedure. In times of national crisis, personal attachments compromise service. They are distractions. We must maintain unimpeachable standards, in character as well as conduct, or the entire edifice of this effort collapses. The silent warning. The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, no direct accusation of impropriety, but a clear, damning condemnation of the nature of the bond. Matron Davies had made it abundantly clear that she was not just supervising the ward, she was policing the personal lives of her staff. The matron paused, letting her warning sink in. I suggest, Nurse Vance, that you focus solely on your chart readings and your duties. Avoid any activity that could lead to misinterpretation, or worse, disciplinary action. She did not wait for a reply, turning on her heel and leaving Clara standing in the rapidly cooling theater, the scrub nurse's mask now feeling like a muzzle. Clara did not look at Eleanor, who was frozen by the instrument table. She didn't need to. The matron's warning was a shared wound. Their secret, which had felt like a defiant source of warmth, was now a liability, actively targeted by a watchful, moral enemy. The easy, coded glances and the shared sanctuary of the boiler room were no longer safe. That night, they deliberately avoided their 2300 hours meeting. The weight of the matron's vigilance had successfully driven a cold wedge between them, transforming their clandestine love from an act of quiet survival into a deeply frightening game of espionage within the very walls of their workplace. Chapter 6. The Telegram and the Empty Map. The abrupt silence. The blow came not from a bomb or a reprimand from Lieutenant Finch, but from a scrap of official military telegram tape that appeared on Eli's desk, tucked beneath a stack of freshly corrected harbor charts. The message was terse, impersonal, and devastating. PTE. T.A. Unit designation. Forward deployment effective 0400 hours 48 hours hence. Report to Rail Depot for Eastern Transit. There was no allowance for goodbyes, no courtesy, and no consideration for the human consequences. There was only the cold, mechanical necessity of war. Thomas was being shipped out, far beyond the reach of a coded surgical suture tin or a darkened warehouse. He was moving from the relative, if terrifying, safety of the home front to the brutal, frozen expanse of the Eastern Front, a location Eli charted daily, knowing with professional precision the lethality of every mile of territory Thomas would traverse. The telegram offered 48 hours, 2 days to exist in the same city, unable to speak, unable to touch, under the constant, suffocating watch of Lieutenant Finch, who seemed to materialize in the logistics office whenever Eli so much as paused for breath. The knowledge was a lead weight in Eli's stomach, threatening to make him physically ill. The final, unseen farewell. Eli spent the next 48 hours charting Thomas's journey. He did this obsessively, not for the Corps, but for himself, using his cartographer's tools to track the projected rail lines, the probable refueling points, and the final estimated drop-off zone, a frozen, nameless junction near the Urals. It was a futile gesture, but it was the only way he could feel close to the man he was losing to the map. He couldn't risk a final physical farewell. Finch had increased patrols in the evenings, citing a need to deter espionage. A soldier meeting a comrade late at night before transit would be too easily construed as a passing of sensitive information, or worse, a breach of conduct. At 3 o'clock on the morning of Thomas's departure, Eli executed his own private ritual. He slipped into the logistics warehouse, the same one they had used for their first few clandestine meetings. He didn't expect Thomas to be there, but he needed the connection to the shared space. He reached the massive stone pier beneath the gantry crane, the old bridge, and found only dust. But as he turned to leave, His hand brushed a small, smooth stone tucked into the crease where the pier met the floor. It was a familiar piece of polished slate, a trinket Thomas carried. Etched roughly into its surface was a single, tiny, careful star, Eli's coded mark. It was Thomas's goodbye. "I am carrying you with me." Eli pocketed the stone, the coolness of the rock a fierce, aching comfort against his palm, and walked back to the garrison, his heart already navigating the desolate miles between Oakhaven and the frozen east. The new ritual, letters to nowhere. The separation instantly created a perilous new reliance on the written word. Thomas would be sending letters through official military mail, and Eli would be replying via the same slow, censored channel. Their new code had to be subtle enough to survive not just postal censors looking for military secrets, but Lieutenant Finch, who now personally reviewed all irregular correspondence entering and leaving the logistics base. The system was intricate and agonizingly slow. Thomas would write about the weather and the difficulty of the terrain. His true messages, his emotional state, his location, his personal fears, were hidden in the metaphorical density of his descriptions. For example, a phrase like, "The snow here is so heavy, it makes the hills look like burial mounds, but the ground is firm beneath the drift," meant, "I am terrified of the casualties, but I am still alive and holding steady." Eli, in turn, would hide his replies in detailed critiques of the maps he was sending out, discussing non-existent topographical errors or the necessary replacement of certain key symbols, which Thomas alone knew correlated to certain coded emotional responses. The near discovery of the unseen. 2 weeks after Thomas's departure, a letter arrived, stamped with the appropriate military seals but bearing the unmistakable grime of the Eastern Front. Eli took it to the small, shared lunchroom to read it in isolation. Thomas wrote beautifully about the austere beauty of the terrain. "The sun this morning was like a perfect, lonely coin dropped into a bank of clouds. I have never seen a sky so vast and empty, Eli, but the light it casts is unforgivingly clear." Eli's trained eye immediately registered the code. Lonely meant he was isolated and struggling. Unforgivingly clear meant the danger was immediate and constant. Just as Eli was reaching for his pen to begin composing a reply, a coded map critique about imprecise cartography near the 42nd parallel, Lieutenant Finch walked in. He didn't come to inspect, but simply to sit and eat his lunch. Eli's hand froze mid-air. He realized the letter lay open on the table, and next to it, the polishing cloth and a tiny vial of oil he kept hidden in his pocket. He had been using them to clean the rough slate stone Thomas had left him, a highly irregular habit for a corporal in the middle of a workday. Finch looked from the letter to Eli's face, then to the vial of oil, a slow, methodical assessment in his sharp eyes. "A beautiful hand, that," Finch remarked, completely devoid of inflection, referring to Thomas's elegant, albeit rushed, cursive. "What part of the front does the author serve?" Eli forced a steady reply. "An artillery detachment, Lieutenant. He writes mostly about the landscape. Helps pass the time." Finch picked up the letter, casually scanning the lines Thomas had intended as code. He chuckled, a dry, unsettling sound. "Sentimental. But perhaps that's what keeps them fighting. See to your maps, Thorn. Sentimentality is a poor substitute for precision." Eli's breath hitched as Finch placed the letter back down, the cloth and oil miraculously ignored, the code unseen. The immediate, brutal terror of the moment confirmed that every single piece of communication, no matter how censored or coded, was a high-stakes gamble. The distance had made their love exponentially more dangerous. Chapter 7. The Fault in the Ledger. The Unjust Accusation. The shadow of Matron Davies's suspicion had curtailed Clara and Dr. Albright's meetings, but the crisis that followed was far more damaging than a quiet reprimand. It arrived disguised as a routine administrative review. A senior military official, visiting St. Jude's on an inspection tour, questioned Dr. Albright's procedure regarding a recent, complicated shrapnel removal. The patient had died hours after the surgery. While post-operative mortality was tragically common, the official, a man known for his rigid, by-the-book mindset, pointed to an apparent discrepancy in the recorded amount of anesthetic used and the final, signed ledger entry. The implication, subtle at first but rapidly accelerating, was that Dr. Albright had been reckless, perhaps even negligent. The accusation was fueled not by fact, but by the undercurrent of prejudice that dogged Eleanor, her gender, her uncompromising authority, and her lack of traditional social connections. Matron Davies, seizing the opportunity to impose her own moral order, silently supported the investigation, treating the matter as a gross professional failure rather than a tragic wartime inevitability. The official decision: Dr. Albright was temporarily suspended from all major surgical duties pending a formal inquiry. The humiliation was crushing. Eleanor was a healer, and to be barred from the operating theater was akin to a soldier being barred from the front. Clara's espionage. The suspension threw the hospital into tense disarray, but for Clara, it was a call to action. Their relationship could withstand secrecy, but it could not survive the destruction of Eleanor's career and reputation. Clara was uniquely positioned to investigate. As a meticulous nurse, she had access to the day-to-day records, the stock inventories, and the chaotic, sometimes illegible, surgical notes that lay scattered across the administrative office. Her mission was simple: find the truth buried in the paperwork. She began her clandestine work in the dead of night, after her shift officially ended. Instead of slipping off to her cot, she claimed extra charting time. She moved into the dimly lit records room, a cavern of stacked ledgers and filing cabinets. The room smelled of old paper and dust, and the silence here was absolute, magnifying the anxious thumping of her own heart. She worked with the same focused intensity she brought to the operating theater, tracing the paper trail backward. She examined the initial pre-op notes, the pharmacist's logs, the circulating nurse's checklist, and the final surgical report. The error, she soon realized, was not in Dr. Albright's procedure, but in the chaos of wartime supply. The initial surgical order had requested a specific, high-potency form of anesthetic. However, due to a severe supply interruption on the docks, a disruption that Eli, coincidentally, had charted weeks earlier, the hospital pharmacist had substituted a slightly lower potency, higher volume alternative. Dr. Albright, focused on the immediate life-or-death crisis of the surgery, had used the correct volume of the available substitute, but the paperwork, the final ledger entry signed off by an overworked clerk hours later, still listed the original, higher potency drug name, making the volume used appear excessive and therefore reckless. The unforeseen compromise. Clara felt a surge of exhilaration. She had found the tangible evidence to clear Eleanor. The pharmacist's original substitution note, scribbled on a small, unofficial slip of paper, was tucked inside a forgotten supply inventory binder dated 3 weeks prior. It was proof that the discrepancy was administrative, not professional. But as she compared the dates, a new, sickening realization hit her. The pharmacist's substitution note was legitimate, but the inventory log itself, the log that proved the low-potency drug was used, was dated the day after the surgery. Clara remembered that day clearly, a night of such confusion that paperwork was secondary to saving lives. The night nurse on duty, overwhelmed and knowing the substitution had been made, had backdated the supply log simply to maintain the hospital's appearance of order. That night nurse was Clara herself. The weight of the ledger felt heavy and damning in her hands. She could present the substitution note and clear Eleanor, but the inquiry would inevitably pull the entire log. They would see that the entry was backdated, and while it would still clear Eleanor of professional negligence, it would instantly expose Clara to charges of falsifying official military records, a disciplinary offense that could lead to dismissal, or worse, prosecution for impeding the war effort. Her act of kindness to help the exhausted night nurse weeks ago now stood as a silent, powerful weapon aimed directly at her. Clara sat in the cold, silent room, the two pieces of paper, Eleanor's vindication and her own self-condemnation, laid side by side. The war had placed her on a moral precipice. To save the woman she loved, she would have to sacrifice her own secure place in the system. The integrity of their unseen romance demanded a public act of professional risk, moving their struggle out of the shadows and into the direct line of fire from Matron Davies and the military inspector. Chapter 8. The Coded Plea. The Waiting Game. The rhythm of Eli's life had devolved into a frantic, repetitive loop, sorting manifests, enduring Lieutenant Finch's relentless surveillance, and waiting for the mail. Days bled into weeks, and Thomas's letters, once infrequent, became rare, then almost non-existent. The absence was a living, breathing thing in Eli's small life. He continued to send his own coded critiques of the supply maps, instructions on how to correct the alignment of the 42nd parallel, hold steady, I'm waiting, or warnings about unreliable river crossing points, be careful, the danger is too great. But the silence in return was deafening. He knew Thomas was in a deep strike position, but the total lack of contact was unprecedented, suggesting Thomas was either cut off entirely or under such intense scrutiny that writing was impossible. Eli had begun sleeping on the drafting table, waking stiff and covered in the faint, metallic scent of graphite and old paper. He was worn down not by work, but by perpetual anxiety. He felt the cold pressure of Finch's eyes on him constantly, and he knew his facade of professionalism was fraying. His salvation, and his ultimate undoing, arrived on a cold Thursday morning, tucked into a bundle of high-priority dispatch notices. The final cipher. The envelope was thin and stiff, lacking the usual heavy postal stamp. It had been hand-delivered by a weary-looking courier who simply dropped it onto Eli's desk and vanished. It was addressed officially to Logistics Records Keeper, Corporal E. Thorne, but the address was written in Thomas's familiar, quick hand. Eli's fingers were shaking so violently he almost couldn't break the seal. Inside was a single, densely written page. Not a letter, but what appeared to be a highly technical, dry military field report concerning the structural integrity of a recently secured enemy railway line near the front line. It detailed specific vulnerabilities in a bridge span, citing the exact coordinates and mentioning a plan to rig it for demolition as a fallback measure. But this was no mere field report. This was their final, most dangerous cipher. Thomas had hidden his true message in the language of demolition. Eli saw it instantly. The technical jargon, when decoded through the specific system they had agreed upon, cross-referencing the fourth word in every third line with a specific column on a pre-war German-English dictionary they both owned, yielded a terrifying narrative. Coordinates, xx.yy, colon, equals I am trapped. Vulnerability in the eastern span is critical. Equals I have been exposed. Demolition sequence scheduled for 0600 hours. Equals I am making a break for it at dawn. Requires 2 personnel, but only 1 is authorized. Equals I am going alone. Target, neutral zone city, code name, the Silent Sentinel. Equals meet me in Valerie. Now, the abyss of choice. The truth hit Eli with the force of a physical blow. Thomas was compromised, likely exposed by the new surveillance and running from the military courts, and was planning a suicidal escape into the neutral zone, possibly using the demolition as a diversion. He was asking Eli to desert his post, traverse hundreds of miles of war-torn territory, and meet him in an enemy-adjacent city code-named Valerie. Eli locked the office door, sank into his chair, and spread his large-scale map of the Eastern Front across the table. He found the coordinates Thomas had cited, a point deep in the enemy's rear, accessible only by risky, unauthorized travel through mountainous territory. Valerie was a small, neutral territory situated precariously on the conflict's edge, a haven for refugees and deserters, but a death trap for any soldier caught there. His choice was immediate, agonizing, and absolute. Duty and safety. Burn the letter, report the suspicious correspondence to Finch, and wait out the war, knowing Thomas would likely be caught, tried for desertion, or killed in the attempt. Eli would live, but his life would be hollowed out by cowardice and loss. Love and sacrifice, tear up his life. Use his knowledge of supply routes and troop movements, the very skills he had promised to the Corps, to go after Thomas. He would be risking execution for desertion and treason, but he would be validating the unseen love that had been his only reason to survive the war. Eli took the piece of polished slate, the small farewell stone Thomas had left him weeks ago, and placed it on the map right over Valerie. He stared at the name, the Silent Sentinel. The silence was loud, demanding an answer. The cartographer in him knew the probability of success was near zero, but the man in him, the desperate, loving heart, knew he could not chart a life without Thomas. He would go. He would use his maps not for the war, but to save his love. Chapter 9. The Confession of the Ledger. The Weight of Silence. For 3 agonizing days, Clara carried the ledger sheets, the pharmacist's substitution note, and her own backdated supply log, hidden beneath the floorboards of her shared nurses' quarters. She barely slept. Her shifts were torturous, performed under the watchful, triumphant glare of Matron Davies, who treated Dr. Albright's suspension as a public vindication of her own moral conservatism. Eleanor, forced into administrative tasks, was a ghost in the hospital corridors, her competence caged, her spirit visibly diminished by the professional banishment. Clara watched her, the weight of the secret ledger burning a hole in her conscience. She knew she could present only the pharmacist's note. It would clear Eleanor immediately. But the inquiry would linger, and the original messy trail of paperwork might still be uncovered, exposing the backdating later and leading to a much harsher fallout for both of them. To protect their future, to ensure Eleanor's restoration was absolute and beyond reproach, Clara realized the confession had to be total. The only way to save Eleanor was to preemptively expose herself, controlling the damage. The logic was painful but undeniable. Love demanded a complete self-exposure in a world that demanded utter concealment. The interview. Clara made her decision just before dawn on the 4th day. She requested an immediate private audience with Major Thompson, the high-ranking military official overseeing the inquiry. The meeting was granted quickly, held in the sterile, mahogany-paneled hospital administrator's office, a room that felt miles away from the life-and-death chaos of the wards. Major Thompson sat across the large desk, stern and impatient. Matron Davies sat beside him, her face a mask of pinched satisfaction. Clara, dressed in her cleanest, stiffest uniform, felt utterly exposed. She laid the 2 pieces of paper, the substitution note and her own log, on the desk, positioning them with the professional care she would use placing surgical instruments. Major Thompson, matron, Clara began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The discrepancy in Dr. Albright's anesthetic ledger is an administrative error, not a surgical one. The original surgical order for high-potency anesthetic was substituted due to supply issues, a fact confirmed by this pharmacist's note. Major Thompson leaned forward, his interest piqued. A clear explanation, Nurse Vance. This substantiates Dr. Albright's claim of professional soundness. We can conclude the inquiry here. The act of sacrifice. No, Major, Clara interrupted, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. You cannot conclude the inquiry there. There is a further irregularity. I was the night nurse on duty overseeing the final inventory count. The substitution was made, but to maintain the appearance of order, which was paramount that week, I made an unauthorized decision to backdate the final supply log entry by 24 hours. The fault in the ledger is mine. Dr. Albright used the correct quantity of the available drug. I used the incorrect date on the paperwork. A stunned silence fell over the room. Major Thompson stared at the 2 documents, and Matron Davies's composure finally fractured. Her face registered pure, unfiltered shock, followed by a surge of vindictive triumph. She had wanted to prove Eleanor morally bankrupt. Clara had just gifted her proof of a direct disciplinary breach. "You admit to falsifying official military records, Nurse Vance?" Major Thompson asked, his voice low with disbelief. "I admit to backdating an inventory log, sir, to ensure the continuity of our supply records. I did it under extreme duress, prioritizing documentation over proper procedure. I did not do it to cover a crime, but to hide a logistical failure that was not Dr. Albright's fault. I take full responsibility for the violation of protocol." The aftermath. Clara's strategic confession worked exactly as planned. The inquiry's focus immediately shifted from Eleanor's surgical competence to Clara's conduct. Eleanor was cleared within the hour. The pharmacist's note, combined with the admission of a clerical error by a subordinate, instantly absolved her of negligence. Eleanor was restored to full surgical duty, her career saved. Clara, however, was immediately placed on suspension and referred for a formal military review. As she left the administrator's office, stripped of her duties, she passed Eleanor in the hallway. Eleanor's expression was a tumultuous mix of relief, fury, and dawning understanding. She moved as if to speak, but Matron Davies was already supervising Clara's escort out of the building. They exchanged only a single, devastating look, a silent communication that contained the agonizing recognition of the debt, the cost, and the terrifying new reality of their sacrifice. Clara knew her own wartime service was likely over, perhaps ending in disgrace. But she walked out into the chilly Oakhaven morning feeling a strange, profound lightness. She had protected the woman she loved. By sacrificing her reputation, she had cemented their shared future, whatever fragile form it might take. She was now completely exposed, having committed a high-risk act of defiance, yet she felt more truly herself than she had in years. Chapter 10. The Convergence, Part 1. The Calculated Desertion. Eli's final act as Corporal Thorne was executed with the same meticulous precision he applied to charting troop movements, but with a terrifying inversion of purpose. He spent his last night in Oakhaven in the logistics office, meticulously preparing his own escape map. He utilized his access to high-grade topographical charts, marking every rail line, every known military checkpoint, and every rumored civilian smuggling route between the coast and the neutral city of Valerie. His chart was a masterpiece of defiance, a single red line, thinner than a hair, cutting across the blue and black symbols of war, his path to Thomas. Before dawn, he stripped his uniform of all rank and identifying insignia, retaining only the serviceable khaki trousers, thick wool shirt, and greatcoat, which he deliberately scuffed and dirted to resemble a common refugee or a discharged worker. He pocketed the polished slate stone, his only compass now the desperate pull of love. He didn't leave a note. He simply melted into the early morning gloom, blending with the weary stream of laborers heading to the docks. He had calculated that his absence would not be officially noted for 12 hours, buying him a critical head start against military intelligence. The underbelly of the rail system. Eli's journey began with the rail network. His first challenge was getting onto an eastbound military supply train. He used his knowledge of the logistics corps' scheduling gaps, finding a massive, slow-moving train hauling machinery and covered artillery pieces. Near a remote maintenance yard, he slipped past a sleeping guard and managed to hoist himself onto an open-topped coal tender, burrowing deep into the black dust. The hours that followed were a sensory blur of grinding steel, choking coal dust, and the bone-jarring rattle of the high-speed journey. The filth was a blessing. It covered his uniform and changed his appearance, a disguise far more effective than any civilian clothing. The constant movement, however, was psychological torture. Every tunnel felt like a burial. Every screech of the brakes was an imagined checkpoint search. He survived on a tin of stale biscuits and the meager water he had packed. He dared not close his eyes, scanning the passing landscape against the map etched into his mind, meticulously tracking his progress toward the Eastern Front. The first hurdle, the military checkpoint. After 2 days of agonizing, near-sleepless travel, the train stopped abruptly at a major staging post near the established military interior line, the final, heavily guarded gateway to the active war zone. This was a place where papers were checked, cargo was inspected, and deserters were summarily apprehended. Eli knew he couldn't ride the train through. Under the cover of a dense, freezing fog that rolled in from the marshlands, he slipped out of the coal tender. His plan was to skirt the checkpoint perimeter by traversing the maintenance yard's labyrinthine piping and drainage system. He moved low and fast, his heart slamming against his ribs. He was almost past the final barbed wire fence when he heard the sharp, urgent bark of a military police dog. He scrambled into a shallow drainage culvert, the freezing muck immediately soaking through his clothes. He heard boots crunching nearby and saw the beam of a powerful flashlight slicing through the fog, followed by the deep, insistent growl of the German shepherd. Eli froze, pressing his face into the cold, chemical-smelling water. The dog stopped directly above the culvert, its sniffing growing frantic and localized. Eli could hear the sharp exhalation of the animal's breath. He closed his eyes, accepting that this was the end of his journey, of his life, and of his hope to find Thomas. Just as the guard was about to pull the dog away, Eli saw a rusted, discarded shovel handle lying beside him in the mud. Acting purely on instinct, he shifted his weight, sending the handle rolling silently into a pile of scrap metal 10 feet away. The sudden, minor noise instantly drew the dog's attention. The guard, frustrated, shouted at the dog and tugged the leash, pulling the animal away to investigate the scrap. Eli stayed buried in the cold mud for another 15 minutes, until the sounds of the military patrol had faded completely, leaving him alone, trembling and utterly filthy, but alive and past the final official checkpoint. The long, cold walk. The rail line was now behind him. He had crossed the interior line, trading the danger of arrest for the danger of the elements and the active conflict. He began walking across open, freezing scrubland toward the border mountains. The landscape was desolate, marked by the skeletal remains of abandoned farmhouses and the dark, churned earth of old shell craters. He knew he was hours behind Thomas's projected escape window, and the further he walked, the more he realized the severity of his desperation. He was walking into a military area with no papers, no official standing, and no backup, a lonely red line cutting across a vast, unforgiving map. The small, cold slate stone in his pocket was the only thing preventing the paralyzing terror from overwhelming him. He had to reach Valerie. He had to find Thomas. Chapter 11. The Cost of Salvation. The Verdict of the Board. Clara's disciplinary review was a perfunctory affair, held in a stuffy, wood-paneled room that smelled of old tobacco smoke and judgment. Major Thompson presided, flanked by a rigid military advocate and, inevitably, Matron Davies, whose posture alone was a condemnation. Clara stood for 30 minutes, offering her defense. Not a plea for leniency, but a precise, clinical explanation of how prioritizing a patient's life over clerical procedure led to her error. She maintained that Dr. Albright was innocent of professional malpractice, and her backdating of the log was a fault of expediency, not malicious intent. The board listened with stony indifference. The verdict was delivered swiftly. Her outstanding service record was acknowledged, a small, cold mercy, but the gravity of tampering with official wartime supply documentation was deemed too severe for simple reprimand. Clara Vance was immediately discharged from all volunteer military service, effective immediately. The language was carefully chosen, not treason or sabotage, but conduct compromising the integrity of official records. It was a public stain, an official closing of the door to the life she had built. As the board members rose, Matron Davies finally spoke, her voice low and venomous. "You chose sentimentality, Nurse Vance. You chose attachment over duty. The hospital has no place for such emotional indiscipline." Clara simply nodded, taking the full, crushing weight of the sacrifice onto her shoulders. She had traded her future for Eleanor's. The last sanctuary. Clara was given 2 hours to clear her belongings. She packed her few personal items, her spare uniform, a worn copy of poetry, and the hidden notes of Dr. Albright, and walked down the long corridor toward the staff exit. Waiting for her in the small, rarely used hospital garden, tucked behind a high brick wall and a tangle of winter-bare rose bushes, was Eleanor. She was not in her surgical scrubs but in her civilian dress, a dark, tailored suit that spoke of quiet competence and unshakable self-possession. The moment Eleanor saw Clara, the rigid composure she maintained in the hospital vanished. She rushed forward, her hands grasping Clara's shoulders, her eyes flooded with a brilliant, painful mixture of love and guilt. "Clara, why? Why did you tell them about the date? I could have taken the temporary suspension. We could have fought it." Her voice was tight, barely a whisper. Clara looked into the turbulent depths of her eyes and understood. Eleanor felt diminished, saved by a cost she could not repay. Clara shook her head gently. "It wasn't about the suspension, Eleanor. It was about the inquiry. They would have kept digging. They would have used it to break your reputation, to silence you permanently. I had to end it, absolutely. The administrative error I confessed to, they can understand. The moral stain they wanted to impose on you? That would have killed you." She placed her hands over Eleanor's, a gesture of quiet, final affirmation. "You save lives, Eleanor. You are the critical resource. I am just a nurse. My sacrifice is sustainable. Yours was not." The heavy embrace. Eleanor pulled Clara into a fierce, almost desperate embrace, holding her tight amidst the cold scent of the rose bushes. It was the longest, most exposed moment of physical affection they had ever shared, devoid of the hurried fear of the boiler room, but weighted by the permanence of Clara's fate. "I owe you everything," Eleanor murmured into her hair. "You are the bravest person I know. You chose the truth when they demand lies." Clara stepped back, her eyes meeting Eleanor's with a determined intensity. "I did it so we can have a chance at that future, the one we wrote in the margins of those journal pages. Now, you must fulfill your part. You will not let them break you. You will continue to operate, continue to challenge them, and you will wait for me." She smiled, a weary, genuine smile. "I am discharged, Eleanor, but I am not gone. I will stay in Oakhaven. I will find civilian work, perhaps helping the refugees. We will simply have to be more careful, more clever. Our life now is entirely outside the hospital walls." Eleanor nodded, the brilliant, practical surgeon reasserting herself, her eyes shining with renewed resolve. "I will not waste this, Clara. I promise. Every successful surgery, every new technique, will be a defiant gesture, a victory bought by you." They shared a long, final glance that sealed their pact. Clara turned and walked out of the garden gate, carrying only her small bag and the quiet certainty of her love. She was a civilian now, an outcast, but she was free of the hospital's rules. Her struggle was no longer about hiding, but about building a real, visible life together. A new, fragile target for a judging world to aim at. Chapter 12. The Convergence, Part 2. The Silent Sentinel. Eli reached the outskirts of Valerie 3 days after deserting his post, his uniform threadbare, his body racked by fever and exhaustion. Valerie, code-named the Silent Sentinel, was a grotesque spectacle, a city officially neutral in the Ember conflict, but practically a human dumping ground. It was packed with refugees, spies, deserters from every army, and the desperate flotsam of a continent at war. The air was thick with smoke from hastily constructed cook fires, the babble of a dozen languages, and the pervasive scent of fear. He slipped past the poorly guarded perimeter at dusk, using the dense fog that clung to the riverbanks. His presence here was an invitation to disaster. As an unauthorized soldier from the opposing side, he could be shot by any faction, arrested by the local constabulary, or preyed upon by criminal elements. He needed to find Thomas before Thomas was found by the enemy. Eli relied entirely on his former training. He didn't ask questions, he observed. His expertise was in patterns of movement and infrastructure. He bypassed the main refugee camps, too chaotic, and instead focused on the city's underbelly, the deserted industrial sector, the forgotten rail spurs, and the small, independent medical clinics that operated outside the government's watchful eye. He reasoned that Thomas, injured or compromised, would seek a space that was both isolated and capable of providing basic survival needs. Tracing the faint signal. His search focused on infrastructure decay. He found his first clue near a dilapidated, unused train depot, the kind Thomas, who had experience with wartime logistics, would naturally gravitate toward. On a crumbling brick wall near the maintenance shed, Eli noticed a patch of fresh mud that was slightly darker than the surrounding filth. Embedded in the mud, barely visible, was a small, three-pronged indentation. Eli recognized it instantly, the specialized treadmark from the military-issue boots Thomas's unit used, a pattern distinctive from standard infantry gear. The find gave him a surge of adrenaline, replacing his exhaustion with fierce focus. Thomas was here, or had been recently. Eli followed the faint trail of marks for half an hour, leading him through back alleys filled with refuse and into the shadow of a large, abandoned textile mill. The marks stopped abruptly at the mill's service entrance, a heavy steel door that looked permanently sealed. Eli inspected the door. There was no conventional lock, but a heavy iron bar had been crudely bolted across the frame. He knew Thomas, a man of ingenuity, forced to rely on unconventional methods. He circled the door twice. There, near the bottom hinge, he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible scratch mark in the grime, shaped like the beginning of an arrow. The field hospital of shadows. Following the direction of the arrow, Eli moved around the massive, silent mill. He eventually found a loose, cellar-level window, heavily obscured by decades of soot. Prying it open required every ounce of his remaining strength. He slipped inside, dropping onto a floor of broken glass and cold concrete. The building was vast and echoing, filled with the ghostly shapes of rusting machinery. The air was frigid, but not entirely frigid. He followed the faint sound of a muffled cough and the sight of a dim, flickering light deep within the mill's central core. As he moved, the metallic chill gave way to a distinct chemical smell, antiseptic and cauterization. He realized he was in a clandestine, makeshift field hospital, operating beneath the radar of Valerie's authorities. He pushed through a heavy canvas sheet strung between two support pillars and found himself in a chaotic, makeshift ward. A handful of weary, gray-faced doctors, clearly military personnel who had shed their uniforms, attended to rows of wounded men, all wearing hastily applied bandages and civilian blankets. No one wore rank. Everyone was a deserter, a survivor, or a refugee. In the farthest corner, separated from the main ward by a stack of lumber, Eli saw him. Thomas. He was lying on a low cot, his face pale and drawn. His left arm was wrapped in heavy bandages, pinned against his chest. He was talking in a low, pained whisper to a nurse with a thick accent. The coded plea hadn't been an exaggeration. Thomas was severely wounded. The sight of him, simultaneously alive and grievously hurt, momentarily paralyzed Eli. As Eli took a silent step forward, a massive, bearded man, clearly a former sergeant major acting as security, stepped out of the shadows, his hand immediately going to a sidearm tucked into his belt. "Stop right there, comrade," the man growled, his voice a low threat. "Who are you, and how did you find this place?" Eli didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out the cold, smooth slate stone with the carved star, and held it out, his hand shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. "I am a cartographer," Eli managed, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I charted his life. I am here to correct his alignment." The guard stared at the stone, then at Eli's exhausted, filthy face, and finally lowered his hand, recognizing the profound, unique truth of the language before him. "He's been waiting for you," the guard simply said, stepping aside. Eli walked toward Thomas's cot, the noise of the ward fading into silence. Thomas looked up, his eyes widening in stunned relief, and a weak, genuine smile finally broke through the pain on his face. Their unseen romance, forged in coded ink, had culminated in a desperate, physical meeting on the edge of the world. Chapter 13. The final line of the map. The unseen meeting. The reunion was silent, immediate, and utterly devastating. Eli reached the cot and knelt beside Thomas. Thomas's good hand immediately grabbed Eli's, clutching the coal-grimed wool of his coat with a fierce, possessive strength. The silence between them was not the sanctuary of their past meetings, but a heavy, shared acknowledgement of the impossible odds. "You came," Thomas whispered, his voice thin with pain, his eyes burning with fever. "I knew you would read the demolition code correctly. The bridge was never the target. It was the delivery." "We don't have time," Eli said, his voice flat with urgency. He quickly examined the bandaged arm. It was a severe shrapnel wound, poorly treated, showing signs of infection. "You can't walk. We have to move now. I saw a patrol on the river road outside the industrial sector. The Valerie police will sweep this place by dawn. They want to appear neutral by cleaning out the deserters." Thomas shook his head weakly. "I can't run. The arm is pinned. I was shot during the break for the train line." He squeezed Eli's hand. "I only needed you to see the final truth of it, Eli. To know that the risk was real. Now, you must go. You have the papers. You can disappear into the south." Eli looked around the filthy, makeshift hospital, the dim lights, the faces of wounded men who had nowhere left to go. "We leave together," he stated, his voice final, the cartographer making a non-negotiable decree. "I spent 2 weeks charting this trip. My map doesn't end here. It ends when we are safe." The improvised escape plan. Eli immediately shifted from lover to logistics officer. He approached the bearded sergeant major, whose name he learned was Boris, and spoke quickly, professionally, utilizing the precise, non-emotional language of supply routes and timelines that Boris immediately understood. "We need a small, fast vehicle and passage through the south perimeter," Eli stated. "I know the layout of the old sewage culverts near the rail yard. If we can reach the river, we can use the old fishing cutter docked there. The route is unmonitored." Boris, recognizing a desperate man with a concrete plan, agreed to provide a stolen civilian truck for the initial distance in exchange for Eli's last remaining supply of dried rations and penicillin he had taken from the Corps. Eli turned back to Thomas. His plan was simple and suicidal: transport a severely wounded man across a volatile, uncontrolled border. He fashioned an improvised sling for Thomas's arm using an old canvas sheet and insisted Thomas dress in the clothes of one of the recovered, discharged refugees, further obscuring his identity. He even smeared a thick layer of axle grease onto Thomas's face and hands, adding to the disguise. The midnight dash. The clock read 2:30. The air was frigid, the silence of the city deceptive. Boris helped load Thomas into the back of a battered, canvas-covered pickup truck. Eli climbed into the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the empty streets. As the engine coughed and roared to life, starting their final most dangerous dash, Eli pulled out the small polished slate stone, the farewell gift Thomas had left weeks earlier. He rubbed the star etched into its surface. "I need you to tell me exactly how the sewage culvert system runs under the rail yard," Eli instructed, his voice low and urgent. "The main outflow pipe, is it marked by a double or single concrete junction?" Thomas, despite his pain, understood the request instantly. Eli wasn't just driving, he was actively charting the escape route in real time, relying on Thomas's field knowledge to correct the map. Thomas gritted his teeth, suppressing a groan as the truck hit a pothole. "Single junction, Eli. It's rusted at the cap. But the main line runs directly beneath the old ammunition factory. You have to take the immediate left before the factory wall, or you'll run straight into the border guard post." Eli nodded, relaying the instruction to Boris, whose driving was reckless and skilled. The final crisis at the perimeter. They reached the end of the line, the low, concrete junction where the culvert met the river road. Boris stopped the truck. The river was just 50 yards away, veiled in mist, and the dark shape of the abandoned fishing cutter was just visible. But between them and the cutter was a small, temporary military barrier, manned by 3 weary, heavily armed guards from the border patrol, drinking coffee around a low fire. They were trapped. "We can't go through them," Boris muttered, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. "Too many guns." Eli's mind raced, searching his internal maps for an unseen route. There was none. There was only the barrier, the river, and the impossible choice. Then, he remembered Thomas's coded message from weeks ago, the field report detailing the vulnerabilities of the railway bridge further north, the one he had intended to demolish as a diversion for his original solo escape. The information was likely known only to a handful of people in Thomas's old unit. Eli leaned out the window and shouted, his voice sharp and authoritative, projecting the absolute confidence of a ranking officer. "Guard! Stop what you are doing. Emergency intel. The Eastern Railway Bridge, the one near coordinates XX.YY, is compromised. Enemy counter-sabotage. Get to your radios immediately and report an immediate threat to the supply line." The unexpected shout, the use of precise coordinates, and the urgent mention of a known high-value asset, the railway bridge, immediately caused chaos among the guards. They stared at the truck, momentarily paralyzed by the conflicting orders. Eli knew the moment of doubt was fleeting. "Go, Boris. Now." The truck roared forward, tearing through the flimsy barrier, scattering the guards and their fire. As they reached the riverbank, Eli could hear the chaotic sound of shouts and scattered rifle fire behind them. They tumbled Thomas out of the truck, dragging him the final few feet to the small fishing cutter, Boris covering them with a rusted machine gun. Eli pulled Thomas into the small, freezing cabin, stripped off his borrowed civilian coat, and began frantically cutting the mooring ropes. He looked at Thomas, whose face was contorted in pain but whose eyes shone with adrenaline and fierce, proud victory. They had survived. They had charted their own final line of defense, validating their unseen love with an act of outright, successful defiance against the war itself. Chapter 14. The Defining End. The Ebbing of the Conflict. Eli and Thomas spent 5 precarious, agonizing weeks sailing south, hugging the coastline toward a small, unclaimed territory on the Mediterranean that promised amnesty for political refugees, a tiny on Eli's map that represented their only possible future. Thomas's fever raged, fueled by the infection in his arm, and Eli, relying only on his scarce medical supplies and the sheer force of his will, became nurse, cook, navigator, and guard. He used his knowledge of naval codes to skirt military patrols and relied on his cartography skills to navigate the treacherous, uncharted shallow waters. Their love, born of shared glances and coded ink, was hardened in the close, desperate quarters of the cutter's cabin. It was in this small, freezing cabin, listening to a garbled, faint broadcast on a broken radio they had salvaged, that they heard the news. The Ember conflict was over. The broadcast was confusing, filled with nationalist rhetoric and cautious announcements of an armistice, but the core truth was unmistakable. The massive, brutal mechanism that had defined their lives and criminalized their love had finally ground to a halt. Thomas, his fever finally broken, listened to the news with quiet resignation. "We survived the war," he murmured, looking at Eli. "Now we face the peace. The peace is built by the same men who signed the war." Eli knew he was right. The laws that made them criminals had not vanished with the signing of the armistice. They were simply waiting for the soldiers to return home. The return to scrutiny. Clara's post-war life in Oakhaven was one of deliberate, challenging rebuilding. Discharged from service, she immediately took up work with a civilian charity aiding displaced families, using her organizational skills and medical training in the chaos of peacetime recovery. Her public disgrace, the dismissal for conduct compromising records, was a persistent, painful background hum. She wore it like a badge of courage. Dr. Eleanor Albright, restored to her full position, became a force of progressive change within St. Jude's. Protected by her restored reputation, she subtly pushed for reforms, championing better care and fairer administrative practices. Her success was constant, but her private life remained a complex, delicate dance. She and Clara could no longer use the hospital as their sanctuary. Their meetings moved to Clara's small, cold apartment, or to crowded, anonymous public parks, a fragile private defiance in a city eager to return to pre-war social norms. One rainy afternoon, Clara received a package wrapped in heavy, oilskin-backed paper. Inside was the final, meticulous, hand-drawn chart Eli had ever created, a map detailing the safe waters of a small, free port in the Mediterranean, their new destination. Tucked into the roll was a single, clean sheet of paper with 4 words written in Thomas's unmistakable, hurried script. "The Sentinel is waiting." The final, silent signal for their long-awaited reunion. The defining end. The true conclusion of their story was not the end of the war, but the choice to live visibly. 2 months after the armistice, Eli and Thomas, having secured passage and forged identification papers in the free port, returned to the continent, landing far from Oakhaven. They did not try to hide their connection. They lived as 2 men who had served and were now building a home, enduring the stares, the whispers, and the polite social ostracization. Their shared history was their shield. Clara and Eleanor made their own choice. Eleanor resigned from St. Jude's, refusing to practice within an institution that had punished the woman who saved her. She opened a small, independent clinic focused on veteran care, with Clara managing the administration and nursing duties. Their professional partnership was transparent, and their private life, while still discreet, was anchored by their work and their shared home. They became known as a formidable, if unorthodox, pair, 2 women who had survived the war and now demanded to define their own terms of peace. Their generation, having witnessed the failure of rigid dogma, began to look at these pairs, the 2 former soldiers who had deserted to save each other, the surgeon and the nurse who risked ruin for love, not as moral failures, but as survivors who chose humanity. The silent narratives of Eli and Thomas, and Clara and Eleanor, became the blueprint for those who followed, proving that the most profound human connections could not only survive devastation but could redefine what was worth fighting for. They were the whispers from the war that became the quiet truth of the generation that followed.